Please be seated. I have this vivid memory of crossing the threshold and entering into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris after waiting for what felt like hours to a 13-year-old me, but being blown away by what I stepped into, in awe of the sight of this giant cathedral, unlike any space that I had ever been in before. I remember just taking it all in, these vaulted arches that seemed to be reaching up into the heavens, the never-ending stained glass lining the clerestory up above, refracting the light in all shades of blues and reds and yellows. Seeing the intricate stonework everywhere, chapels in so many of the apses, statues of Mary everywhere, the ornate nature of it all, the sort of glowing rose window at the back. I remember just trying to take it all in and feeling so small in the face of it, so overwhelmed by the grandeur of it. I don't know at 13 how much I was internalizing it as a spiritual experience, but I do know that I experienced a sense of grandness, of awe, of wonder at what had been made centuries before and added onto and expanded and prayed in, and there I was within it. And the cathedral felt like a world in and of itself. The only thing to remind me of the world that I had stepped out of and into it was the stream of tourists coming in through the back and making their way around it. It was like a whole universe in and of itself, a space outside of time, outside of place, a little slice of eternity. And I also remember going back to my little country church in North Carolina and how underwhelming it felt. This simple space, somewhat utilitarian, built in the 1950s, with the red carpet running down the aisle and the simple wooden pews, and the two speakers that the organ music played out of that always sounded kind of grainy. It didn't capture that majesty. It felt like a space not just of different degree, but of a different kind entirely. It just didn't feel I didn't feel that sense of awe, of grandeur, of wonder that I had there in that cathedral in Paris. But over time, I came to embrace a sense of awe and wonder even from that space. And it was not about grandeur or any sort of ornate woodwork or stonework. It was about what was behind the altar. You see, in that little church, there was no stained glass, but a clear window behind the altar that looked northward, or looked kind of eastward, out towards the line of the Tusquity Mountains. The church sat up on a hill, so you could look out over cow pastures that gave way to forests that finally gave way to that line of mountains. You could see the shape of the ridge line silhouetted in all seasons. From the first sort of tinges of that vibrant bright green in spring to the dull-toned solid green tones of summer, giving way eventually to the eruption of color in the fall, and finally to the bare grays and browns of winter. Every season, that ridgeline maintained its shape. And even as a teenager, it called out to me. It beckoned as that this is where I wanted to be there nestled in those mountains. Worship a God who is there in the church, but also there in that line of mountains off in the distance. And it had its own kind of wonder to it. Today we celebrate the feast of Christ the King. It's the culmination of the church year, which begins on the first Sunday of Advent and goes all the way to this Sunday. This is the day when we celebrate Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as the one who sits enthroned in the heavens, who was and is to come, who is the Alpha and the Omega. The same Jesus Christ who sits enthroned above the heavens is the same one who we begin the church year with, anticipating his birth, hearing the prophecies of the one who is to come. He's the same one who we celebrate on Christmas Day, who was born in the lowly stable in Bethlehem, the same one whose life, ministry, whose healings and miracles we follow in the seasons after Epiphany and after Pentecost, the same one who we follow into the gates of Jerusalem through his triumphal entry and eventual trial and torture, execution, and finally through the resurrection. And today, as we honor him who was and is to come, who is seated enthroned above the heavens, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean for Christ to be king? What does this idea of the reign of God mean to us? And in our gospel reading today, we hear Pontius Pilate wrestling with that same question. Are you the king of the Jews? He asks Jesus. And Jesus answers him, but not in a way that directly addresses the question. He will go on to say, my kingdom is not of this world. There's a reason that Pilate is asking this question. Because there was a lot of concern at this time over the coming of a new king of Israel. This was a time of great tension and a pretty tenuous relationship in that part of the world, which is a reality that never quite seems to go away. But in this moment, Rome has control over Israel and Judea and over Jerusalem, but they know that it's a tenuous one. They've experienced kind of wave after wave of these would-be Messiah figures, these people who claim to be the king of Israel, who was proclaimed in the prophets and in the book of Daniel, who has come to liberate their people, to set Israel free, and to make them sovereign over their own lands again. And so Rome has a vested interest in anyone who claims to be the king of the Jews, other than the puppet king Herod, who they've placed on the throne. And so when Pilate asks these questions, he is concerned, he is wondering if Jesus is going to be another one of those would-be kings, gathering a band of followers around him, ready to take up arms and to storm into Jerusalem, seeking to overthrow the Roman authorities within it. And Jesus said to him, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, I would act just like all of those other would-be kings. If it were of this world, I would be gathering those people around me. I would be taking up arms, and I would be coming to these gates in a much different spirit. And yet that's not what he does. He stands there before Pilate, ready to accept the fate that will be given to him, and continues to affirm that he is the king, but that his kingdom is not of this world, that he has come to testify to the truth, that his kingdom is grounded in something else, that it comes from somewhere else. It would be easy to read these verses as Jesus speaking of himself as the sort of king above heaven, completely separate from this world. That this profane world, this sinful world, this broken world is not where his kingdom is, but his kingdom is somewhere else, in this better place up in the skies, this sort of ideal world, universe that exists beyond or parallel to this one. Sort of like a giant cathedral walled off from the world around it, that Jesus' kingdom is some separate realm that can completely shut out the world that the rest of us are living in. But that's not what he is saying. When he says that his kingdom is not from this world, it's not a claim of having no authority or power within this world. It's not a denial of the reality and importance of the day-to-day lives that we all live. It's not to deny the very real earthly life that Jesus lived with his disciples, the very real love that he felt for the people around him, and the love that he felt for his people Israel, and for the promises that God had made to them, that they would be redeemed, that they would be brought into the eternal love and embrace of God. His claiming that his kingdom is not from this world is not denying the world, but asserting his power over it and within it. You see, what Jesus realizes is that the power of the Pontius Pilate who stands before him, just like the power of the chief priests and the scribes, is temporary. It's contingent. The people of Israel had seen one empire come into power after another, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Persians and the Seleucids, and now the Romans. What Jesus is aware of is that every empire will fall, every earthly leader will die, every earthly power will fade away. But that his kingship, his reign within and over the earth is not based in this sort of passing fancy of the moment, but is grounded in God's eternal law of love. That is where his kingdom is from. That is where he draws his authority from being one with God. He draws his authority from that law of love that God spoke into being when he created the universe. He draws from God's law of love by coming into this world to redeem the world. And it is God's law of love that he knows will ultimately draw all people into God's self. When Jesus asserts a power, an authority, a reign that is not from this world, he is asserting a reign that is eternal, that supersedes all of the temporary forces and powers and principalities of this earth. Empires will come and go. Kings will rise and fall. Dynasties will fall down. Presidents will be voted in and voted out. Supreme Court justices will come and go. All the powers of this earth will fade away. And yet, over it all stands Christ the King. Not claiming authority and power by domination, but through the sheer force of love. The love that brought the world into being, the love that redeems it, the love that sustains it, and the love that seeks to bring all of the earth into wholeness and oneness with God. And in order to see that love, Jesus doesn't ask that we close ourselves off from the world, but that we look at it with clear eyes. We look at it through the lens of his life, death, and resurrection. That we look through the cruciform shape of a clear window at the back of a church and see the mountains that were created by God, that are held by God, that are ever being formed and shaped in the love of God. And Christ asks us always to see through clear windows, to see his presence in the world, to identify the ways that his reign of love exists alongside the sinfulness and brokenness and tragedies of our very lives. To do the hard work of identifying how love is still present even when the darkness seems the darkest, even when it seems there is no hope for what is to come, even when it seems like there is no hope for us as individuals or as communities or as nations or as an entire species moving forward. Christ asks us to see his kingship of love at work around us. And that is the challenge before us as we celebrate this feast of Christ the King. To ground ourselves in God's law of love that breathed the world into being, that sustains it, that redeems us, and that seeks to bring us together into eternal oneness with God. And so on this feast of Christ the King, may we not shut ourselves off to the world around us, but open ourselves to God's love that is at work within us, among us, and all around us. That we may trust that even as earthly powers rise and fall, that God is there sustaining all of it in God's eternal and all-powerful and everlasting love. Amen.